power, prestige, a black robe that symbolizes justice. For years, Judge Daniel Whitmore was the man people feared, respected, and trusted to uphold the law. But in November 2023, the same system he once controlled came knocking at his door. The smell hit them first, a scent no amount of air fresheners could hide. The house was too quiet, the blinds drawn too tight. And in the master bedroom, beneath layers of blankets and desperate attempts to mask the decay, they found her. Emma Whitmore, his wife of 27 years. Dead, decomposing, hidden in plain sight. The judge had been living with his wife's corpse for 4 weeks. But this wasn't just a tragic accident, a case of grief gone wrong. Number because behind Emma's death lay a secret buried far deeper than her body, a secret that, if exposed, would bring everything crashing down. So what happens when a man who spent his life punishing criminals becomes one himself? Buckle up, because this case isn't just about murder. It's about deception, power, and a past that refused to stay buried. Let's get into it. To the people of Lexington, Kentucky, Judge Daniel Whitmore wasn't just a man, he was an institution. A towering figure in the courthouse, his name carries weight in legal circles across the state. He had sent murderers to prison for life. He had broken crime syndicates with a single verdict. He had built a career on one simple truth: justice was blind. But justice, as it turns out, had never truly looked into his past. At 58 years old, Daniel Whitmore was the embodiment of authority. He walked into a courtroom, and the room fell silent. His presence alone demanded respect. He wasn't a man who needed to raise his voice. One sharp glance over his glasses was enough to make even the most seasoned attorneys second-guess themselves. His words carried weight, shaping destinies with a single verdict. He had spent decades building a reputation as a man of integrity, a pillar of justice, someone who couldn't be swayed by emotion or outside influence. Beyond the courthouse, he was seen as the picture of decency. With his neatly combed, silver-streaked hair, pressed suits, and calm, calculated demeanor, he looked like a man without sin. His record was spotless, his private life seemingly unremarkable. There were no scandals, no whispers of impropriety, just a highly respected judge with a career that had defined the legal system in Lexington. To the world, Daniel Whitmore was the kind of man you could trust, a man who upheld the very laws meant to protect society. Emma Whitmore was the opposite in every way. She was warm when he was cold. At 56, she had a smile that put people at ease, a natural charm that made her the center of every room she entered. She had spent nearly 30 years standing beside her husband, playing the role of the perfect judge's wife. Always composed, always supportive, always knowing exactly what to say. At charity events, she worked the room effortlessly, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, making sure no one ever felt out of place. Where Daniel was known for his intimidating presence, Emma was known for her kindness. She remembered names, details, birthdays, things her husband never concerned himself with. If Daniel was the enforcer of justice, Emma was the one who made sure people believed in it. Daniel and Emma Whitmore met in the fall of 1991 at a legal seminar in Cincinnati. He was a young, ambitious attorney with a sharp mind and an even sharper suit. She was an up-and-coming journalist covering legal affairs for a local newspaper. Their connection was instant. Daniel was drawn to Emma's warmth and intelligence, while Emma admired Daniel's confidence and ambition. Their relationship moved quickly. Within a year, they were married, standing before family and friends in a ceremony that seemed to mark the beginning of a picture-perfect life. To those who knew them, they were the ideal couple. Daniel, the no-nonsense lawyer with a bright future, and Emma, the charming, supportive wife who could light up any room. They built a life together, a beautiful home, a network of influential friends. A marriage that, from the outside, seemed unshakable. But beneath the polished image, there were cracks, subtle at first, barely noticeable to those around them. For years, they tried to have children. Emma wanted a family, a house filled with laughter and little footsteps. Daniel, however, had reservations, concerns he never fully voiced. He told her they would try, that maybe someday they would be ready. But someday it never came. Instead, Their life became one of obligations, charity events, legal functions, carefully orchestrated appearances. They seemed like the perfect balance, strict and gentle, cold and warm, power and grace. But beneath the carefully curated image, behind the grand home, and the perfectly planned dinner parties, the Whitmore's marriage was built on something far more fragile. And by the time anyone realized the cracks had formed, it was already too late. Because behind the grand home, the elegant dinner parties, the meticulously planned charity galas, the Whitmore's marriage was rotting from the inside out. And by the time police found Emma's body, the truth had already begun to decay along with her. But the secret Daniel Whitmore had spent decades burying didn't start with his wife's murder. It began long before he ever wore a judge's robe, long before he built his career on the very laws he had once broken. Long before Daniel Whitmore sat on the bench, before he swore to uphold justice, he was just another face in a grainy police sketch. A kid from nowhere, a boy with a secret so damning it would chase him for decades. Lexington knew him as Judge Whitmore, but in another life, he had a different name, a different past. A past that started on a cold October night in 1983, just outside Louisville. A man was found in a dark alley behind a rundown bar, his skull fractured, his pockets emptied. Witnesses recalled seeing a teenager fleeing the scene, his hands stained with blood, his face filled with panic. He was never caught. The case went cold, and the name Daniel Whitmore never appeared in the reports. But another name did, a name that vanished right before a new one was created. The case was never solved. The boy was never caught. The name Daniel Whitmore never appeared in the reports. But another name did, a name that vanished right before a new one was created. Because in 1984, a scared teenager disappeared from Kentucky, leaving no trace of the life he once lived. And in 1985, a young man with no past enrolled in law school 3 states away. Daniel Whitmore built his life on a lie, a name change, a fresh start. He had erased his past, buried it under years of legal victories, powerful connections, and a reputation that demanded respect. But secrets like his don't stay buried forever, and Emma had unknowingly started digging in the one place she was never supposed to look. In the summer of 2023, Emma found something she was never meant to see. An old box, a stack of newspaper clippings, a name she didn't recognize, a photo of a young man that looked just like her husband, but with someone else's name. And with one simple question, one moment of curiosity, Emma Whitmore became the most dangerous person in her husband's life, because she knew the truth. And Daniel Whitmore couldn't let her live. This is where the mask finally slipped. This is where a judge, a man sworn to uphold the law, became a fugitive from it. And the murder he covered up as a teenager? It was nothing compared to what came next. Now let's go deeper. What really happened to Emma Whitmore? How did a respected judge cover up the unthinkable? And how did the past come crashing back to destroy him? Stay with me, because this case is far from over. Before Judge Daniel Whitmore sat on the bench, before the title and the authority, there was another story, a story he buried long before he ever stepped foot in a courtroom. Back in 1983, a small-town bar in Mississippi became the scene of an unsolved murder. A bartender, 42-year-old Hank Gibson, was shot 3 times in the chest after a dispute with a teenage boy. Witnesses described the suspect as a lanky kid with sharp features and a temper that flared without warning. No name was ever confirmed, no arrest was ever made. That boy disappeared that night and was never seen again. The case went cold. No family came forward to claim him. No records matched. It was as if he never existed. But some who saw the grainy police sketch in the newspapers swore they recognized the face years later. Only now it belonged to a man with a different name, a man who had traded a troubled past for a future in law. Because before Daniel Whitmore was a judge, he was someone else. A new identity, a new state, a fresh start. Daniel reinvented himself, leaving behind a life that no longer served him. By the time he stepped into law school, the past was nothing more than a distant shadow. He built his reputation, climbed the ranks, and became a man no one dared to question. He was methodical, precise, every detail of his life carefully constructed to leave no room for doubt. But then came Emma. Unlike the colleagues who admired him or the defendants who feared him, Emma wasn't someone who accepted half-truths. She noticed things, small inconsistencies, missing details. At first it was nothing, forgotten childhood stories, vague mentions of family. But as the years passed, the gaps in his past became too wide to ignore. The first sign was the nightmares. Restless nights, deep breaths in the dark, a tension in his body that never quite faded. When asked, he dismissed it. Stress from work, exhaustion, nothing more. But the way his shoulders tightened, the way his hands sometimes shook, it wasn't just the weight of his career. It was something else. Then there was the photograph. Tucked away in an old box in the garage, hidden between stacks of law school notes and case files. A black and white picture faded at the edges, showing 3 teenage boys outside a rundown bar. One of them was unmistakably him, leaner, younger, but still him. Below the photo, 4 names were written in blue ink, but only 3 boys were in the picture. The discovery unsettled her. She had spent years by his side, yet so much of his past remained untouched, unanswered. And when she brought it up, his reaction was immediate. He took the photo from her hands, discarded it without a second glance. The unshakable judge, the man who thrived under pressure, had faltered. That was when she knew. She started digging. Old records, missing persons reports, anything that could explain the unease that had settled in her chest. What she found was a police report from 1983. A bartender shot 3 times in a bar dispute. Witnesses described a teenage suspect, a boy with sharp features, a quick temper. The composite sketch wasn't perfect, but it was familiar. Emma didn't confront him right away. Instead, she watched, studied him the way he had studied criminals in his courtroom. The way his expression tightened when she asked about his past. The way his hands clenched when she lingered too long on certain questions. And then there were the late nights. The way he stood in the dim glow of the kitchen, staring at nothing. The murmured phone calls when he thought she was asleep. The way he looked at her now. Not with love, but with something else. Something colder. She considered leaving, packing a bag, disappearing before he could suspect a thing. But then came the whispers, calls from blocked numbers, strange voices on the other end that never said a word. A creeping feeling that she wasn't just uncovering the past, but that the past was watching her too. And by the time she realized the danger she was in, it was already too late. No one knows exactly what happened next. Did Emma threaten to go to the police? Did she demand the truth? Or had Daniel already made up his mind that she knew too much? What we do know is this. On the night of October 14th, the walls of the Whitmore home held a conversation that would never be repeated. Neighbors later recalled muffled voices rising in intensity, a crash, a single sharp scream, and then nothing. The next morning, Judge Daniel Whitmore arrived at the courthouse, just like he had every day for the past 20 years. He presided over hearings, shook hands, delivered rulings with the same measured authority that had made him a force in Lexington's legal world. But back at home, behind the locked doors of his pristine suburban estate, Emma Whitmore lay motionless on the bedroom floor. Hours passed, then days, then weeks. The house, once filled with warmth and conversation, was now a silent tomb. The curtains remained drawn. The outside world saw nothing unusual, except for one thing. Emma had vanished. At first, Daniel played the role of the worried husband. He told friends she had gone on a trip to visit family. When her sister called, he let it go to voicemail. When neighbors asked, he smiled, reassured them she was fine, just needing some space. But the truth was rotting inside that house. He hadn't reported her missing. He hadn't called the police. He hadn't told a soul, because he knew exactly where she was. For nearly 4 weeks, Judge Daniel Whitmore lived his life as if nothing had happened. He showed up at work, presided over cases, shook hands with colleagues, and delivered rulings that shaped people's futures, all while his wife's body was decaying inside their home. The house, once pristine, had become a tomb. Neighbors had noticed things, subtle at first. The blinds stayed shut even during the day. The once meticulously maintained lawn was left unkempt. And then there was the mail. It was a postal worker who first raised the alarm. A package sat untouched for days. Bills overflowed from the mailbox. It was the kind of thing that didn't happen in the Whitmore household. Someone mentioned it to a neighbor, who mentioned it to another. Eventually, someone called the police. When officers arrived on November 10th, 2023, they expected a routine welfare check. Maybe Emma had gone out of town. Maybe she was too sick to answer the door. But from the moment Daniel opened it, they knew something was wrong. The air was thick, stale. The overpowering scent of air fresheners only made the officers more uneasy. And then they found her. Emma Whitmore, 56 years old, deceased, covered in blankets, left in the bed she had once shared with her husband. Daniel was calm at first. He claimed she had died in her sleep, that he hadn't known what to do, that grief had paralyzed him. But when detectives started asking questions, his story began to unravel. Detectives noticed inconsistencies right away. If Emma had simply died in her sleep, why hadn't he reported it? Why had he continued going to work as if nothing had happened? And why were there clear signs that someone had tried to cover up the smell of decomposition? The officers at the scene wasted no time securing the house. A search warrant was issued, and within hours, forensic teams were combing through every inch of the Whitmore residence. The bed where Emma's body had been found showed more than just signs of death. It showed signs of a struggle. The sheets were torn. A nightstand lamp had been knocked over. Underneath her fingernails, technicians found microscopic traces of skin, evidence that she had fought back. And then there was the bedroom door. The latch was broken, as if someone had forced it open. Daniel maintained his innocence. He insisted that Emma had simply passed away and that he had panicked. But investigators weren't buying it. The timeline didn't make sense. If he had been so grief-stricken, why had he never called 911? Why had he gone to work, held court, and maintained his routine as if nothing had happened? The breaking point came when detectives gained access to Emma's phone records. Her last outgoing call had been on the night of October 14th at 9:47 p.m. She had called a friend, someone she spoke to regularly, but in the middle of the conversation she abruptly hung up. That friend later told police that Emma had sounded nervous, even frightened. She never answered another call after that. In the days following her death, Daniel made no attempts to contact anyone about Emma's whereabouts. There were no funeral arrangements, no phone calls to family. Instead, there were credit card transactions, groceries, dry cleaning, even a dinner at an upscale steakhouse. The judge had continued his life as if nothing had happened, but the biggest revelation came when detectives uncovered something buried deep in Emma's personal belongings: her notes. Pages upon pages of handwritten entries, detailing an investigation she had been conducting on her own husband. Emma had been searching for answers, and she had found them. Inside an old shoebox, detectives uncovered newspaper clippings dating back nearly 4 decades. One article stood out: an unsolved murder from 1982, a bar fight that had ended in death. The victim was a 19-year-old college student, while the suspect was an unidentified teenage boy who had vanished without a trace. The case had gone cold, with authorities believing the suspect had fled the state and taken on a new identity. Among Emma's personal belongings, they found pages of handwritten notes. She had been searching for answers, piecing together details from Daniel's past. The connections were undeniable. She had circled key parts of the article and written observations that left little room for doubt. She had come to a chilling conclusion. Investigators now had a clear motive. Emma had uncovered something that had been buried for decades. If she had confronted Daniel with what she knew, it could explain everything that followed. Forensic analysis confirmed that her death had not been natural. The autopsy revealed bruising around her neck, small fractures in the cartilage, clear signs of strangulation. It was now undeniable. Emma Whitmore had been murdered. On November 12th, 2023, Judge Daniel Whitmore was formally charged with the murder of his wife. The news sent shockwaves through Lexington's legal community. A man who had once passed sentences on criminals now stood accused of taking a life. The very system he had controlled for years would now decide his fate. But the investigation wasn't over. Prosecutors were building their case, retracing the final days before Emma's death, searching for the evidence that would seal Whitmore's fate in court. The trial ahead would not only determine his guilt, but also reveal the full extent of the secrets he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. The case against Daniel Whitmore moved swiftly, the weight of his reputation only intensifying the scrutiny. A judge accused of murder was a spectacle the public and the media couldn't ignore. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, dissecting every detail. The city of Lexington, once proud of its esteemed judge, was now divided, some in disbelief, others convinced they had been deceived all along. Prosecutors wasted no time building their case. Emma Whitmore had been silenced because she uncovered something from her husband's past. Her death wasn't the result of an argument gone too far. It was a calculated decision, and Daniel Whitmore had spent his entire career ensuring secrets like his never saw the light of day. Investigators traced Emma's steps in the weeks before her murder. Phone records revealed that she had made several calls to a retired private investigator named Martin Reynolds. He had worked on missing persons and unsolved homicides for decades, but what stood out was his involvement in a 1982 murder case. That case had remained cold, but Emma had been asking about it. She had requested old reports, asked about a missing suspect, and pressed for details that no one had looked at in years. Authorities combed through archived records and found the connection Emma had been trying to make. The 1982 case involved a young woman who had been strangled, her body left in a wooded area outside of Louisville. The primary suspect was a man matching Daniel Whitmore's description, tall, dark-haired, and living under a different name at the time. But the case had fallen apart due to lack of evidence, and the suspect had disappeared. The deeper detectives dug, the clearer it became. Emma hadn't just suspected her husband had a secret. She had found proof. And before she could expose him, he ensured she never got the chance. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution laid out their evidence. Emma's research, her attempts to contact law enforcement, the neighbors who heard raised voices on the night of October 14th. The autopsy confirmed that she had been strangled, and forensic analysis linked fibers from Daniel's clothing to the blankets used to conceal her body. And then came the final revelation. DNA collected from the 1982 crime scene was reanalyzed using modern forensic technology. The results left no room for doubt. It was a match. Daniel Whitmore had been living a lie for over 40 years. On January 26, 2024, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. A man who once sentenced others now faced the same fate. Life in prison, no parole, no escape from the past he had spent decades trying to bury. Emma Whitmore had lost her life searching for justice, but in the end, her determination brought the truth to light. And as Daniel Whitmore sat in his prison cell, stripped of his title, his influence, and his freedom, there was no courtroom left to manipulate, no system left to control. He was no longer Judge Whitmore. He was just another convicted killer. In the days following the verdict, Lexington remained in disbelief. The courthouse where Daniel Whitmore once commanded authority now stood as a symbol of his downfall. His colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the disgrace of a man they once respected. But the case wasn't over. Emma Whitmore's murder had forced investigators to take a closer look at her husband's past. What they found raised more questions than answers. Daniel Whitmore's life before law school was unusually difficult to trace. He had legally changed his name in the mid-1980s, a decision that had drawn little attention at the time. But now that name change has become a critical clue. Detectives reopened a decades-old cold case in Louisville, the 1982 murder of Cynthia Blair. Cynthia had been 22 years old when she was found strangled in an abandoned building. The crime had remained unsolved, with no clear suspects. But now Whitmore's history placed him in Louisville at the time of the murder. The details of the crime, the method, the calculated attempt to hide the body, bore striking similarities to Emma's case. The deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling the pattern became. A second case emerged, This one from 1985 in Tennessee. Rebecca Holloway, a young woman who had vanished after leaving a bar, was found weeks later in a wooded area. The case had gone cold, with no DNA evidence available at the time. Authorities now suspected Whitmore had been involved. By February 2024, Kentucky officials confirmed they were re-examining multiple cold cases, conducting DNA comparisons to determine if Whitmore's crimes stretched beyond what had already been uncovered. The possibility that a respected judge had spent his life hiding a violent past sent shockwaves through the legal community. Inside North Point Training Center, where Whitmore was serving his life sentence, he refused to speak. He denied interview requests from journalists and ignored letters from former colleagues. For years, his words had shaped legal decisions, determined fates, and commanded respect. Now silence was all he had left, but silence wouldn't protect him. On March 8, 2024, forensic analysts confirmed a DNA match between Whitmore and evidence from the 1982 Louisville murder. The state moved forward with additional charges, ensuring that even if his current conviction were overturned, he would never walk free again. Public outrage grew. Families of victims demanded accountability. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with people questioning how a man with such a past had climbed to such a position of power. Whitmore's career had been built on the principles of justice, but in the end, justice had caught up with him. And though justice had come far too late for Judge Daniel Whitmore, it had finally arrived. Daniel Whitmore, once the man who decided the fate of others, now awaited his own. The trial was swift, his reputation, his years on the bench, none of it could save him. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man desperate to keep his past hidden, willing to do whatever it took to silence the one person who got too close to the truth. The evidence was undeniable. The bruises, the deleted searches, the inconsistencies in his alibi. And when the jury returned their verdict, it was clear Daniel Whitmore would never wear a judge's robe again. A life sentence, no parole, the same punishment he had handed down to so many before. But this time, he was on the other side of the gavel. His colleagues, the ones who had once respected him, now distanced themselves. His name, once a symbol of authority, became a cautionary tale. The man who spent decades upholding the law had proven that justice, no matter how delayed, always finds a way. Emma Whitmore had tried to expose the truth. She had paid the ultimate price. But in the end, her story wasn't buried. It was uncovered for the world to see. And though justice had come far too late for Judge Daniel Whitmore, it had finally arrived. If you found this case compelling and want to hear more true crime stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We uncover the hidden, the forgotten, and the cases that prove the truth always comes to light. Until next time, stay safe.